Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Brett van Rensburg to What's Next. He's the sales director for iOCO's network division. Brett, firstly, how are you doing, and how's COVID affected you? I imagine that at iOCO it's been good news, because in a sense that everybody has to work remotely, and we're going to be talking about the mobility challenges that we face. But I guess for you, it's been a business boom at iOCO.
Yeah, thanks, Aki. All good my side. Been locked away at home like most others around South Africa. But as you mentioned, from an iOCO perspective, it's been business as usual. What we found is there's been a technology jump, so we've made the change and evolution into this world of working virtually. And from an iOCO perspective, it was fairly seamless. A lot of the tools and pieces of that puzzle were already there. It was just how we put them together. So one day it felt like I was going into the office, and the next day it was just not the case anymore.
Well, I guess you guys have been practicing this for a long time, and you've kind of been ready for this. But the reality is that many of us face these mobility challenges, people working remotely. We're now talking about a hybrid work environment as we start to get back to some kind of a normality, although there's a hint of another wave that's heading our way. If you look at around the world at what's happening in India, for example, parts of Germany, France, etc., this pandemic is so unpredictable that one cannot predict what's going to happen next. So I guess to have that workforce working remotely is really critical, despite, even if we go on a hybrid mode, as many of the top CEOs are talking about when things start to settle down. But that in itself brings its own challenges when it comes to mobility. It's got its advantages and it's got its challenges. I'd love you to dissect on that, please.
Yeah, 100%. So I think in the world of technology, we've been fortunate that things move at a very fast pace. So you're continuously having to evolve with that market. What we've seen with COVID is we've seen it form the catalyst of something completely different. That pace is now exponential in what it was 24 months ago. So as companies try and catch up with this two-speed world we're working in, they're making very quick decisions on what they need to do for their workforce. And we saw it very early on in the process, where organizations were almost overnight had to have their workforce move to their homes, and they made quick decisions around what they did with data and what they did with the technologies and how they protected their data. Now that we've had a year to deal with it, we're seeing organizations start to try and make long-term decisions. They're looking at what that hybrid workforce looks like in the future, and they're now having to consider long-term decisions like rentals of properties. That's a major one that's come into play, because you don't want to be holding on to a massive building that you've got 3 or 4 people walking into every day. It's just a cost that you shouldn't be looking after. So organizations are definitely moving in the direction of these mobile workforces or these hybrid workforces. But I think the challenge here is we still sit on the cusp of, is this going to be a long-term decision? Is this a decision that will stand 5 years from now? Or is this a decision that we're making for the next 12 to 24 months and potentially will have to change again in the future? I think from an iOCO point of view, just reverting back to them, they've been quite clever in this space. They've developed what we deem a Get Space app. So instead of having 5 or 6 different buildings, what we've gone and done is we've created these hybrid workspaces where in the morning, if you need to sit in an office with an individual or you need to have a boardroom, you can jump on the Get Space app, grab the closest space to you, grab that boardroom, set up the parameters of what you need for your meeting, and you can go in and have that meeting. And then the rest of the day, you can work out of a coffee shop or work from home or wherever it might be. And these are the decisions companies are having to try and fumble with at this point.
I mean, it's interesting you talk about that, Brett, because a lot of CEOs that I've spoken to are also talking about this hot desk concept, right? Where, we will share workspaces, and really what's become very evident throughout this pandemic is actually that this remote working is kind of working, albeit from a company culture, you'd have to adjust some things. I mean, a lot of people are talking about the hybrid model, and I guess it's still work in progress, and we're learning a lot of things about how it's going to work in the future, but we do know that it does work at the core. I mean, you're able to function a company even though you have thousands of members of your workforce working remotely. So it's interesting to hear about the future of work, as we just touched on it now, but where do you think it's all going to go?
Yeah, so you touch on an interesting point. I think coming into COVID, there was almost an excitement about being able to work from home. I use my wife as an example. She loved the fact that she didn't have to sit in an hour and a half of traffic every morning and in the evening. So it gave her a little bit of additional flexibility. And what that led into was the fact that she could now put in the extra hours and she didn't feel bad or horrible about putting in those extra hours. So companies almost benefited in the early stages of COVID because individuals were willing to put that extra work in. I think what we have seen, Aki, and we do need to be conscious of it as organizations, is we are seeing that start to taper off, and we're seeing individuals and divisions within organizations start to take more chances, and we're maybe not getting that same level of productivity that we did early on. And this is where your question leads to. Now organizations need to start measuring productivity inside their organization, because you can't walk across to a desk and have a conversation with a colleague anymore. You've now got to have a Zoom call and try catch them online. So we have seen a little bit of productivity management start to fall into this mobility type product set. I think initially it was very much around access and ensuring that the users could get online and work and function. And then it became very much around security. How do you protect data? How do you ensure that your corporate secrets are kept corporate secrets and not shared with the world? And now we're moving into what I feel is the third phase, to ensure that your users remain productive. You don't want to take away the freedoms that have now been created by COVID, but you do want to ensure that you're getting the best out of your users and they're productive. And this is this third phase we're starting to see come into the mobile workforce.
That's very interesting. I'm glad you think that it was exciting at the beginning of COVID with partners. You know, I've spoken to a couple of people that soon died out after 2 months of working in the same environment at home with kids running around. I've spoken to a lot of people that have said, I wish he or she would go back to work now, because it's not easy, but I guess it works and we've adapted to it. But I mean, when you look at the different remote access options and the underlying technology, what benefits do they deliver both for employees and organizations?
Yeah, and there are a lot of them in the space now. So if you look at Sassy as a product set, almost overnight it's become very popular. And I think South Africans as a culture, we very much will dip our toe, we'll feel out of technology, and almost 5 to 6 years later we start to see the adoption of that technology. Whereas the European and America's market are a lot quicker to adopt technology because they can almost turn it around quicker. And that's been, if you look at the last decade, that's how we've adopted technology. In the SaaS space, we haven't had that option. We've had to jump into being able to work remotely. There was just no choice around it. So I think from a technology explosion point of view, we've seen 2 major technologies explode. The one has been SD-WAN. And the reason behind that has largely been the commercial benefit that companies can create. So by adopting SD-WAN across their corporate network, they can very quickly consolidate their office topology geographically around the country, as well as the technology allows for a lot of advantages around your SLA, the reporting, how you manage your users, and most importantly, the commercial benefit. There's a massive commercial benefit there. And then on the Sassy mobility side, we've seen a number of technologies come into that space too. Zscaler, Netscope, Pulse. I mean, there is a list of them, and they've touched on a slightly different model, saying, well, take your corporate office space, and whatever you decide to do with it, there's going to be a component of mobility involved in that. And how we're going to look after that is we're going to look after the security, we're going to look after the firewall as a service, the zero trust, all the important components to ensure that you as a corporate are as protected as you were a year ago. And therefore, it's just become very popular. I think there's a lot of confusion around it, Aki. I think companies are still grappling with how they construct and put the two together, because they still have this corporate office space and they still have these users working at home. And unfortunately, there isn't a silver bullet yet. It's constructing it in the best possible manner for your organization.
And of course, security is absolutely key, as you mentioned. But I mean, there's so many different options that you've just touched on. And I guess companies have been spending like this to adapt to this digital transformation that we're talking about. How does a company actually get the most cost-effective option to do what they need to do in this digital transformation, in this mobility workspace that we're talking about? You know, with a backdrop, there are so many different solutions, but, you know, people are also acutely aware of budget constraints. And I mean, how do you go about choosing the most cost-effective option?
Yeah, Aki, you touched on it right at the end there. I think the world we live in today is budget restraints. The economy isn't what it was, and although there are some companies thriving, 98% of companies within South African parameters are looking to save cost, and unfortunately they always look to the IT services area first, because that's an area that's almost seen as a nice to have, although it runs a lot of business functionality. So when it comes to making these decisions, there's this interesting balancing act that's going on between probably your property portfolio, your rental portfolio, the type of technology you're adopting, the types of technology you're now getting rid of, and then that security and protection component, and balancing that out. For me, the best way to go around it as an organization looking to make these changes today is you've got to go to some of the consultative operations around. So iOCO is a great example. We've got this magic stew of all these different pieces that sit together, and it's putting it in or mixing it in such a way that creates the right flavor for that specific organization. And what I've found over the last 12 months is organizations trying to do it on their own are getting some pieces of that puzzle right, but unfortunately they're getting a lot of it wrong. And what it's ending up doing for them is they're ending up spending a lot more money trying to fix what they didn't get right, or they're leaving themselves in damaging positions where large data is leaked, or information that shouldn't be shared is getting out, or users are doing things they shouldn't be doing, or aren't as productive as they should be. So I think the best way to approach it today is to speak to some of those organizations, ICT organizations in the market that understand this model and have been working with it not for 12 months, but for the last decade. And they'll be able to give you a rubric of where you should be going. And iOCO perfectly positioned, obviously, in that space.
Well, I was just going to ask you, I mean, how can you guys assist? I imagine that you guys have got, years and years of experience that you've built up with thousands of your clients, and you know what your different clients are doing, and you know what works and what doesn't work. So I guess that experience is critical. But how can iOCO assist?
Yeah, certainly, exactly in that space. So I think from our side, it's not cookie cut for any one client. So there's definitely a conversation and understanding that needs to be built. But there are pieces of that puzzle that seem to come together in the financial sector, in the manufacturing sector, in the health and medical, that there are similarities. So from our side, it's one, understanding where you're wanting to go from a strategic point of view, from a longevity point of view. What does that look like commercially for you? And then fitting those two conversations back to the technology that's going to best fit where you're wanting to go. And then I think the other portion that not being considered at this point is the business process that goes behind it. It's not easy to adapt to technology overnight and expect all the users to follow suit perfectly. We just don't live in that sort of world. And what we found over the last year is a lot of companies make technical decisions, and in a lot of instances they're the right technical decisions, but they sit with this tail of disgruntled employees or productivity diving simply because they haven't managed the people behind the technology. So I think, again, where an iOCO comes into play is ensuring that we drive both those processes for you. It's not simply just lifting the technology and making that decision, but making sure that the people behind that organization understand, one, why it's being done, what it means for them, and most importantly, how to operate with this new technology.
Yeah.
It's critical.
And I think, Brett, it's important to start the conversation. You need to have that conversation, because this is not going to go away. We're not going back to the way things were, pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. This is going to be the new way of doing things.
Yeah, certainly. And you mentioned you're speaking to a lot of CEOs that are having to make these decisions, and we're doing exactly the same. And what I find interesting about it is they all seem to be falling in the same place. They'd love to have an organization or workforce that came in 2 to 3 days a week, built that culture within the organization, a much smaller landscape or footprint as far as rentals go, and then you provide them the freedom to work from home half the time, which gives them that nice balance. I think a lot of what's been taken away is it's all about finding the right balance for your organization, and the CEOs that are having conversations with all their staff and understanding their staff and constantly communicating seem to be making the right decisions. So I don't think we're going to go back from here. I think mobility is here to stay. I think it's critical that organizations find the right solution for themselves, and in that they use the right partners to help them pick the right technologies.
Fascinating technology and fascinating discussion. Brett van Rensburg, who is the sales director for iOCO's network division, thank you for joining us on What's Next, and we do appreciate your insights, and certainly a very challenging world that we're living in, but there are solutions and there are ways around, and I think that the great thing is that we've got the technology to do this. I mean, if this pandemic had hit us 10 years ago, it would have been a different story. Brett van Rensburg, thank you for joining us on What's Next.
Yeah, thanks very much, Aki. Thanks very much for having us.